She is Elisabeth Fritzl. She was born on April 6, 1966, in Amstetten, Austria. Amstetten is a city of just over 20,000 inhabitants, located in Lower Austria, one of the 9 states of Austria. It wasn't a small town, but it wasn't a big city either. Things that drew a lot of attention didn't usually happen until this case. It was strange for people to see something so terrible up close, while at the same time they were surrounded by cameras and journalists for the first time. To start this story, I must tell you about Elisabeth's father, who is, as many of you already know and have realized, the other protagonist of this terrible story. Josef Fritzl was born on April 9th, 1935 in Amstetten, Austria. He went through his entire childhood while World War II was taking place, a war in which his father served as a soldier and died in service in 1944. Although when he was very young, his parents had already separated, and he had grown up only with his mother, who in reality did not want to have children. In fact, it seems she didn't even want him. She was not a very loving mother. She took out her frustrations on him by hitting him at every opportunity she had. She would leave him alone for hours, and the only times she saw him, she showed him absolutely no love, but quite the opposite. All of this probably caused something irreparable in him, and he copied all that behavior once he was married to his wife and children. After finishing high school, Fritzl began studying electrical engineering, and at 21 years old, he married a young teenager of 17 named Rosemary. They lived together in a house in Amstetten and appeared to lead a normal and quiet life with the 7 children they had together. In fact, Joseph was loved everywhere. At his job, in the village, everyone knew him, and he seemed very friendly on the outside. But this was far from what was actually happening inside his house and with his family. Joseph was a very violent man. He abused his wife and also his children constantly. At that time, he was described as a very strict man. However, he crossed the line of being strict. At one point in his life, he began to have somewhat more perverse ideas. He spied on people through the windows of their homes, especially at somewhat more intimate moments. And over time, he began to follow certain women on the streets or in parks. Behind them, he began not only to walk, but also to masturbate. Not because he necessarily wanted to be seen, he just followed her while doing that. There are also certain sources that report that Joseph was involved in attempts at sexual abuse or directly in sexual abuse. One of them specifically in 1967 when he was 24 years old. That is, by that time he had taken an extra step. He had stopped following people and was now starting to act. 12 years after getting married, he carries out an attack following a woman and sexually abuses her after forcibly entering her home. After this, he was reported and had to serve 18 months in jail. At that time, Rosemary did not decide to leave, and therefore, when he got out of jail, his family was still with him. What Josef Fritzl did was probably because he did not want to be caught for fulfilling these perverse fantasies he had. He needed someone with whom he could do it in privacy. That's when Elisabeth was born, the 4th of 7 siblings, who had to endure a tough childhood suffering physical abuse and mistreatment from her father. It was in the year 1977, when Elisabeth was 11 years old, that the abuses from her father began to be of a different nature, more of a sexual nature. Throughout her adolescence, Elisabeth didn't have an ounce of privacy. Her father checked absolutely everything, her room, including her diary, and for her part, she lived hidden in her house by orders of her father. The only time he really let her out was with him. Before taking any of his children or his own wife out to do things, Joseph would take Elisabeth. The abuses continued frequently over the next few years. In an attempt to try to escape the hell she was living in, Elisabeth fled her home at 15 years old and stayed hidden with a friend in Vienna. They had fled as far as they could at that time. When the police found her 3 weeks later, they returned her to her home with her parents, without even suspecting the horrors that were taking place there, or even asking why she had fled. Beyond the abuse, she was described by her family as a very sweet girl who would sit for hours looking out the window and watching people go by. She was very quiet and very calm, especially with her family. In fact, she was less calm with her friends. She laughed. She behaved more than anything like a normal girl. But once they got to her house, even though Joseph didn't let anyone through the front door, they noticed that Elisabeth became very reserved, that every time he appeared, she simply fell silent. She became especially shy in front of him. She also didn't participate in things that were common among teenagers, especially in romantic conversations. If any girl liked someone in her class, she didn't participate in those things. It was as if the topic gave her a certain fear, and of course, as you can imagine, Joseph didn't let her have a boyfriend or anything like that. She was unable to get close to boys. Elisabeth's life continued with abuses and increasingly stronger fights with her father, until at 18 years old, on August 28, 1984, Elisabeth Frizzle, from one day to the next, disappears. She didn't take any of her belongings at that moment, nor money or identifications that would be useful to go to another country or state. She had simply gone. It's very hard to explain how nobody noticed, especially the mother, what was really happening to Elisabeth. After the disappearance, the mother began to worry, but it wasn't until a month later that she reported her disappearance to the police. To calm his wife's worries, and especially to try to keep the police from getting involved in any investigation that could potentially implicate him, Joseph came up with a quite incredible story. What's incredible is that the family really thought this was true. Joseph had a letter from Elisabeth arrive in which she said that she had left to join a cult and that she would start a new life like this. This letter was written by Elisabeth herself, but obviously it was fake and nothing more than a letter that Joseph forced her to write. As this coincided with Elisabeth's escapes and her behavior of wanting to leave, there wasn't much more to say. Her friends still didn't believe that was the truth. They knew her and knew there was no way she could leave, let alone join a cult. She hardly ever left her house. She couldn't escape either. That was impossible with that father. She only went to school. Her family was very strict. She would have had to meet someone from such a group, and Elisabeth couldn't. There was simply no way that could happen. Both Rosemary and her siblings and neighbors were left with the idea that she had run away to join this cult. Anyway, there were people who found it a bit strange and who looked for her anyway, like her aunt, Christine Runner. The incredible thing is that even though she was actively alert, she also didn't notice what was really happening, although she did see that Joseph was a bit abnormal. I'm going to explain what the terrible truth behind this story was, and why it seems so strange to me. It seems so strange to all of us that no one noticed or did anything, although it has its explanation. Elisabeth didn't run away to anywhere, and she wasn't in any cult or anything like that. On August 28, 1984, Josef Fritzl called his daughter Elisabeth, who was 18 at the time, under the pretext that she had to help him with some tasks in the basement, to go there. Once downstairs, he asked her for help to place a door, which would be the door to her cell. In the middle, a fight between the two began, as always, and Josef, taking advantage of his wife not being home, this time put his daughter to sleep with chloroform and handcuffed her. After this, he locked her in the cell, where she would remain for the next 24 years. All the time that Josef had been working in his basement, he was preparing it for that. It would be the place where he would lock up his daughter to have the freedom to do whatever he wanted to her. And so Josef continues to lead a normal life upstairs. But when he went down to the basement, he committed the most cruel and repugnant acts. The basement was isolated so that the sounds would not be heard outside, and Josef strictly forbade any member of his family to approach. Being so strict and violent, no one ever dared to contradict him. In those 24 years, not a single person who was in the house, no one wanted to approach the basement. For years, Elisabeth lived in a small cell of about 30 square meters, without windows and in poor cleaning conditions. Let's remember that she couldn't have even a ray of sun, because he couldn't risk leaving a window and someone seeing her. Anyway, it was also forbidden to enter the house's yard. No one could be there unless they were her children, as Elisabeth was immediately below the yard. Josef Fritzl only went down to see her, to feed her, or to abuse and humiliate her in unimaginable ways. As a result of the repeated abuses, Elisabeth gave birth to a total of 7 children who were Josef's grandchildren. The first was born on August 30th, 1988. It was a girl named Kirsten. Elisabeth had to give birth alone in the basement, as Josef refused to take her to the hospital. All he did was give her 2 books on how babies are born and leave her alone to have her first daughter. Luckily, everything went well. Stefan was born 2 years later. Initially, Josef had planned for these boys to also be held captive in the basement along with their mother, but Elisabeth kept getting pregnant. When the third daughter, Lisa, was born in 1991, they no longer all fit in the small cell. So Josef returned to the story of the sect to involve the next children a bit more. He placed baby Lisa in a basket at his own front door, and on top of the basket, he left a letter from Elisabeth saying that she was her daughter and that her sect did not accept babies, and to take care of her until she was older, and then she would come to pick her up. This letter, again, was not true. That is, the part about the sect, of course, had nothing to do with it. But it was indeed written by Elisabeth because she was being forced to do so. Josef put Elisabeth and her children to work to expand the cell to 50 square meters. The fourth daughter, Monica, was born in February of 1994 and was also taken upstairs, using a similar method to the one used with Lisa. Only this time, Josef used a recording of Elisabeth, obviously forced as well, in which she asked that they take care of the baby, just like the first time. In April of 1996, twins were born, one of whom died 3 days after birth. What he had was treatable, but Joseph refused again to take him to the hospital, even though Elisabeth begged him over and over again. He let him die, took the body, and proceeded to incinerate it so that there would be no evidence of it. Alexander, the surviving twin, was taken upstairs with the same story as his brothers before him. The last son, Felix, was born in December of 2002, but Joseph decided to leave him in the basement as he believed that Rosemary would not tolerate the arrival of another son supposedly sent by Elisabeth. This created a situation where 3 of the children, known as the upstairs brothers, lived in the house raised by Fritz and Rosemary, having no idea what was happening in the basement of the house, while the remaining 3 brothers, known as the downstairs brothers, lived in captivity in the small cell with their mother. Joseph also told them that if they tried to escape, gas would enter through the ventilation, and this would kill them. On the other hand, if they touched the main door, they would get an electric shock, so they couldn't try to escape. They also couldn't verify all these things, but they were so scared that they preferred not to try. Despite the tortures, Elisabeth maintained the best life she could for her children. She taught them to read and write, gave them lessons and all the love she could. They also had their routines well established, mostly to not lose their sanity in there. Joseph was an extremely sadistic man. He enjoyed the pain of other people. Those who were above had been chosen for being the noisiest babies, so that they would not attract so much attention, and they were given special treatment, in the sense that they were given a normal but also fun life. That is, they could enjoy not only the sun, but also the garden, which other people could not enter, in addition to also enjoying some toys. So what Joseph did was take pictures of these moments he created with his children from above and show those who were locked up what those lives were like. It was not an attempt to have empathy or try to show them hope, but quite the opposite. He showed them what the sun was, the garden, all these things, just to see their suffering. For his part, Joseph had stopped working as an engineer to create his own real estate company. This allowed for more flexible schedules, enabling him to return to the basement and resume the tortures. In addition, every so often, he would go on business trips and disappear for days. He took advantage of that time to shop in remote places or dispose of the bunker's trash where no one could see him. He divided those days into 2 parts, one part for the hidden family and the other for the visible family. He would go shopping at the local supermarket for the visible family so that everyone could see him. No one suspected anything. And for the hidden family, he would go as far away as possible. And there he would do the shopping so that no one could recognize him and wonder why he was doing that, why he was buying so many things or anything like that. That's how 24 years of these routines of Elisabeth raising her children go by, in captivity in a place without a single ray of sun. Imagine what it causes to grow up without even a bit of sunlight. However, all of this changes on April 19th, 2008. Kirsten, Elisabeth's eldest daughter, was ill and feeling awful. For several days, Elisabeth pleaded with Joseph to take her to the doctor for treatment. On the 19th, he agreed and took her to the local hospital. Kirsten was admitted to the hospital, presenting a severe case of kidney failure, which was an urgent case. One of the first things they noticed was that the girl had no papers. She was nobody to the state. There were no records of her existence anywhere, as remember that she was born in the bunker and never left. That is, really no one knew that this person existed. While treating her, the doctors discovered something that captured their attention even further. In the young woman's pocket, there was a note on purpose where she asked for help and told about the situation she was living in. Upon searching the name Elisabeth, they realized that Kirsten's mother was a woman who had been missing for years. When the doctors asked Josef about this, he gave an answer that left the staff with several doubts, so they decided to notify the police. The police learned that the man claiming to be the hospitalized girl's grandfather is also Elisabeth Frizzle's father. This alone would not be strange, but the situation created in the hospital made it seem like something was being hidden. His granddaughter lacked an identity, and he reacted negatively to everything. He seemed angry all the time, was arrogant, and at the same time did not want to answer important things that could save his granddaughter and help give a better diagnosis of the situation she was in. He first said that his granddaughter Kirsten had been left at his doorstep with a note that seemed to be from Elisabeth. The note said that she was sick and to take care of her. The police began to question Josef, who again tried to deceive them with the story that Elisabeth was in a cult. But this time the police had certain doubts about this story, so they continued investigating. The doctors came forward during the search for Elisabeth, asking her to come back because they had no medical records of their daughter. Maybe if she came back, she would know something to help them. Kirsten was in a coma, and they were doing everything they could to save her. Finding himself cornered by the situation and faced with Elisabeth's demands to see her daughter Kirsten, who was in the hospital suffering. A week after taking Kirsten to the hospital, Josef decided to release Elisabeth and her children on April 26, 2008. After more than 24 years locked up, Elisabeth was going out again to see her daughter in the hospital, an opportunity she did not waste. The first thing she did was go to see her daughter. However, this was just a visit. She didn't want to talk to anyone and seemed very scared. In addition, by that time, she was already 40 years old, an age she had reached in a terrible way. She looked 20 years older. She had aged a lot. Her skin was very bad. When the doctors saw Elisabeth's arrival, with everything that was going on, they notified the police, who took her to take her statement. Initially, they almost accused her of being an accomplice to the confinement. She had to explain her story and counteract what the police believed, but the officers did not expect what had really happened. At first, Elisabeth didn't want to talk, but she finally agreed to tell them on the condition that they promise her she would never see Josef again in her life. Once this was promised, she told them for several hours all the horrors she had suffered during those long 24 years. She was never in a cult or anything like that. She was locked up by her father in a basement specially made for that in 1984. In addition, she said that her daughter Kirsten lived her 19 years of life from the day she was born until she was hospitalized inside that basement with her mother and her 6 siblings. She also told how Josef had forced her to have 7 children with him. And of course, such a story led to the news being exposed quickly. The next day, everyone knew about it. The father, who had not let his daughter out all that time and had done terrible things to her, finally received at least a social condemnation. Meanwhile, those friends, acquaintances, and neighbors of Elisabeth who had seen her disappear finally got an answer with the morning newspaper. Out of nowhere, her face was everywhere, and they simply couldn't believe it. As I said at the beginning of the video, Josef Fritzl didn't want to go back to prison. She didn't want to go through that, but still wanted to satisfy those perversions she had. So she decides, 6 years before the events, that she would devise a perfect plan First, she applies for the necessary permits to build a bomb shelter in her house, which, given the era and what Fritzl had experienced, didn't sound so strange. The best part for her in this situation was that her knowledge as an electrical engineer allowed her to do all the wiring and necessary work by herself. She didn't need anyone else to check anything, and being so strict, no one in the family bothered her. Over time, this bomb shelter was growing. Out of fear that her family might disobey her, she put a lock on the door for added security. It was an electronic lock that required a code for access and a remote control that only she had. As you can see, the front door was hidden behind some shelves, and through a very narrow hallway, you reached the main part, which consisted of a kitchen and a bathroom. Beyond that, there were 2 rooms that apparently were enough to keep Elisabeth and her children away when Josef entered. A pipe provided ventilation. According to the police, these 2 bedrooms each had 2 beds. At least part of this bunker seemed to be padded and well soundproofed. A disturbing detail was also that Josef had rented out a room or 2 in his house to various people. In total, more than 100 people passed through this place. Each of the individuals who rented rooms were told that if they approached the basement and tried to open it, the consequences would be immediate and they would have to leave the house. The same was true for the garden. The yard was absolutely off limits because, of course, it was above the hidden rooms. In fact, one tenant had a dog that occasionally behaved oddly. It would start barking softly without anything being out of place. Its owner didn't know what could be happening. Perhaps the dog was hearing something that he wasn't. Josef made the bunker impossible to escape from. In those 6 years before capturing his daughter, he did everything perfectly to have a place where he could achieve his goals, and no one would interrupt. After all this came to light, Josef was put in prison awaiting trial, and Elisabeth, along with her children, were taken for medical and psychological assistance. The trial was held in March of 2009. Josef was charged with rape, kidnapping, incest, slavery, and murder for the twin who died because he did not take him to the hospital. Most of them, however, in some, like the murder, he declared himself innocent. That's why the trial went on for several days. There was tons of evidence of everything he had done, including more than 10 hours of Elisabeth recounting all the details of what she had suffered. Those who witnessed the trial said they couldn't bear to listen to more than a few minutes of the things she was recounting. When it was her turn to testify at the trial, Elisabeth wrote this in a notebook as she didn't want to be present because Josef was there. The next day, Josef Fritzl changed his mind and pleaded guilty to all charges, being sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole for 15 years. Josef never showed remorse for what he did and has made very controversial statements, such as he was born to rape and many other things that are not worth mentioning, but are nonetheless terrible. On the other hand, other people who were accused of being partly responsible were the social services. The family had legally adopted 3 children who were Elisabeth's children and lived upstairs. They were visited by agents to check their situation and if everything was okay, but they never asked in depth about how they had come to the house. They settled in the way they had arrived at the house. They settled with the letters, which were anyway signed in Elisabeth's own handwriting. So there wasn't much more that could be done. They also went to verify that everything was fine with the bunker construction. Those who were responsible for the approval of the constructions at that time. And of course, since Joseph hadn't started using that place as a prison, nothing happened. On the other hand, both Elisabeth and all her children, as well as Rosemary, were given a new identity and were relocated to a new city that remains unknown so they can start a new life without prejudice. They also receive ongoing psychological and psychiatric help. The only positive thing I can take away from this story is when Felix, Elizabeth's youngest son, comes out of the basement, he had one of the best reactions. He couldn't stop looking outside. He couldn't take his eyes off the car window they were being taken in, because it was the first time he was seeing everything in his life, which is sad, and at the same time a bit touching, but also very sad. Besides that, among all, he was, in fact, the one who best received coming out of the basement, because, remember, he was the one who spent the least years there. However, for some of the children, being outside for the first time was not so easy. It involves a lot of things. In itself, the outside light is blinding. There's a big difference between living in a locked basement and living in a society and having to go through all the experiences that didn't happen in there. But at least we can say that they are now free, that they can finally start to live, even though this happened a few years ago, so they probably have gotten more used to it by now. This case is highly controversial and disputed. Undoubtedly, one of the most important is the fact that no one noticed that several people were kidnapped in the basement of a house. There are several versions that say some neighbors suspected, but it was not common at that time for neighbors to interfere in other people's lives. Getting involved in these matters was frowned upon, but as evident in this case, there was no alternative. Usually, if no one goes to the rescue of others, nothing happens. I'm leaving a video of those up there if you want to go see it. Elisabeth criticized Rosemary for the situation, along with many others. Elisabeth said that it was hard for her to believe that she hadn't realized and that she had believed the whole story of the cult and other things. Some people think that Rosemary could have been an accomplice in all of this. However, the justice system dismissed all charges against her. One of the possible explanations is that Rosemary simply suffered abuse from Fritzl, did not contradict him, and obeyed his orders. Like she couldn't approach the basement for fear of suffering the consequences. The reality is that she probably realized it. Inside, they're being abused by her own father. Inside, being abused by her own father. She didn't know specifically what was happening because she didn't have access to the basement. If she ever went in and her husband found out, we don't know what could have happened to her. In a case like this, where there is so much psychological and physical abuse, it's difficult for a victim to simply stand up to their aggressor and challenge them. Discovering something as terrible as what was happening without really being able to do anything in the basement, but also not being able to approach within meters of the basement. Discovering that something like this was happening in her own home, something so terrible, could have been even worse psychologically, as she could have done nothing. She was likely in deep denial. Also considering that the family had psychologists available and that they would have been examined to determine what was happening inside the house. I doubt she was an accomplice of her own free will, in any case. Rather, she would be an accomplice for not trying to find out what was happening. However, like all the children and people inside, she too was a victim of abuse. As it was learned, Elisabeth and her children are now in good health and trying to move forward with their lives after all the horror they suffered. So, this is where we end with all the information. Tell me what you think about the case down there in the comments. Here are the patrons and channel members. Thank you for supporting me through those means. Here you have a new video. Here you have a recommended video. You can subscribe by clicking on my face and see you in another video. Goodbye.